There's an old Western, came out before I was born, so it's really old, entitled Stars in My Crown. Probably most of you have never seen it. But it seems that there was an elderly black man known all around as Uncle Famous and lived in a small southern town where he had befriended 3 generations of children in innumerable ways. He owned a little farm where he continued to live by himself after his wife had died, and it so happened that some precious metal was discovered in the area, and great pressure was developed to buy up his property and to begin mining the ore. The old man had not lived in a money culture and could not understand this boomtown mentality. All he wanted was to stay in his familiar surroundings until he died, so he refused to even speak of selling out. This led to increasingly angry confrontations. The banker in the town and other commercial interests who wanted the land began to resort to all kinds of terror tactics. They burned down his barn. They shot through his house one night, and then they finally issued the ultimatum that if he did not agree to sell by sundown, then the next night they were coming to lynch him, Ku Klux Klan style. The preacher in the community got wind of this power play and so went to confer with the elderly man. Come sundown that next evening, sure enough, here came the leading citizens in that community, dressed in their white hoods, ropes and all, ready to lynch an innocent man if they did not get their way. The old man came out on the porch, dressed in his Sunday best, with the preacher by his side, and the preacher announced that the old man was ready to meet his fate and had asked him to draw up his last will and testament, which he was going to read at that time. With that, the preacher began to read how the old man was giving his property and all the things that he had to the various individuals who were standing there ready to kill him. He willed the farm to the banker who was so anxious to get his hands on it. He gave his rifle to another of the men who had learned to hunt with it. He gave his fishing pole to another. In fact, item by item, the old man responded to the individuals who were preparing to kill him with acts of generosity and affection. The impact was incredible. Seeing goodness offered in the face of such evil was more than even these greedy men could swallow, and one by one, in shame, they turned away until the lynching mob evaporated altogether. The old preacher's grandson was watching this affair take place at a distance, and when the crisis had passed and the 2 men had gone back in the house, he ran up to his grandfather and he asked him, "What kind of will was that, Granddaddy?" To which the old man replied, "The will of God, son, the will of God." This morning, let us focus on another scene where another innocent man will die if certain people don't get their way. Jesus on the cross. He was lynched, a fate that the elderly black man escaped, thankfully, but his death, like the old man's last will and testament, was the will of God. Why? Our text this morning takes us back to one of those passages in Philippians that we skip for obvious reasons that I want us to come back to this morning. Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. And begin reading with me 2 verses this morning that we skipped earlier as we have been in this letter at verse 8. The 2 verses are verses 8 and 9. No, that's not right. Yeah, that's right. No, that's not right. Let me think where I am here. I had this right, and now I haven't got it right. It's chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. Chapter 3. More than that, I count all things to be a loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them but rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ. Now here's the key. And may be found in Him, not having a righteousness of my own derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness that comes from God because of faith. Now, these two verses tell us, here the Apostle Paul talks about righteousness. And he talks specifically about two kinds of righteousness. There is God's righteousness on the one hand, and then there is the righteousness of self, which the Apostle calls a righteousness of my own. Jesus' death on the cross purchases God's kind of righteousness. This is the only kind of righteousness that God will accept. So this morning, all of us have to make a decision, if we've not already made this decision. What kind of righteousness do we have? Or will we have? What kind? A righteousness of the self, which will always be manifested, and in many different ways, a kind of self-righteousness, or God's kind of righteousness. Consider Jesus on the cross for a moment. He had the authority and the power to call down literally legions of angels to overcome and overpower all those jeering, hate-filled, torturing people who so desperately wanted Him dead. And like the old man in the movie, He did not revile those who reviled Him. He did not repay evil with evil, but evil with good. Again, why? Because by dying on the cross, Jesus provides the only means, the only path to make you and me righteous, right, good, acceptable. And this is something that all of us not only want to feel, we desperately need to feel it, but most people never do. Most of us are like Charlie Brown from the Peanuts comic strip character, one of the characters. He looked at life, and then he looked at himself, and he said, not quite right for the part. There's something about us that doesn't feel quite right for the part. Something within. And quite frankly, what makes us feel not quite right inside is our sinfulness. The inner feeling that there's something about us, something deep inside of us, not quite right. And this feeling of being not quite right for the part manifests itself in all kinds of behaviors. Mostly, they are self-destructive, self-defeating, and very dysfunctional behaviors in which human beings engage in. It also leads to the manifold different ways that humankind tries to make ourselves right in our own sight. Try to make us feel like we are right for the part. And in today's culture, technology has solved that, has been one way that people use. Another is the medical profession has come up with a number of different medications to help us. Psychology has a number of different ways to help us. And there's nothing wrong with either medical help or psychological help if we truly, really need it. But psychological and medical help can only go so far. The answer for what is so deeply and desperately wrong within us cannot come from us, human beings. Absolute success for being right for the part is ultimately impossible because the only one who can fix us is God. And His method is not a righteousness that we can somehow get from someone else. It's not a righteousness that we can get from something. It's not something that we can achieve ourselves. But what our text says here, Christ righteousness. That's the purpose of Jesus on the cross. Achieving what we cannot, what humankind cannot fix, no matter how breathtaking our technology, medical advances, and psychological awareness. What has broken us is so simple and so fundamental, but so utterly beyond us. Only God can make what's not right, right. Jesus does that on the cross. Reconciles all that is not right, right with God, right within ourselves, and right with others. Only God. This is not just God's will. This is not just God's way. This is the only way. It's a lesson that surely humankind would have learned by now through the many millennia of our existence, but sadly, this lesson, this truth, seems to be even further away and out of reach than ever. The problem with us is our sin. As much as we as individuals and as a culture do not want to acknowledge that, do not want to own up to that. We now live in an age where sin has been so marginalized and minimized that we have redefined it nearly out of existence. In fact, one day in the not too near future, we're going to wake up and discover that nothing shall be called wrong. Though ultimately, that's still not going to help us feel right for the part. Not at all. If anything, all it will do is contribute to the feeling of greater self-righteousness. And self-righteousness and pride are virtually synonymous. We are seriously deluded to think that we can achieve a sense of being right by our own efforts or through our achievements or accomplishments or any of the other things that humankind looks upon to tell us that we are right for the part. All our efforts at making ourselves feel right are doomed because of our sin problem. God, like any other good diagnostician, goes to the heart and the root of the problem and deals with it. In fact, Jesus' death on the cross is God's treatment plan for what is wrong with us, our sin. It was, remains to be, and will continue to be the only antidote for what's wrong with human beings. Try telling that, however, to a culture that is drunk on meism, on self-reliance, on the pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps mentality. The Christian view of humankind, that we are all, every last one of us, riddled with sin, goes against the grain of a now nearly completely secularized culture. We can fix ourselves. We can make ourselves right. We need no one else except me, myself, and I. There was a poem written late in the 19th century that has become what I consider to be the anthem for our culture today because it has become more widespread in the last 40 years and more well-known than when it was first written. I'm sure that you're probably acquainted with this poem. I hope that you don't subscribe to it, but I'm sure that you're acquainted with it. The title, Invictus. And it goes something like this. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Doesn't that really get you? Doesn't that really inspire you? Inspires me to throw up, if you want to know the truth of the matter. But anyway, But it's the song, the anthem that many people in our culture sing. And if they don't sing it, they certainly live it. Listen, I find it interesting and telling that those words were the last words on the lips of Timothy McVeigh when he was executed for killing so many people in the worst case of domestic terrorism on American soil in Oklahoma City all those many years ago. Yeah, we're the captain of our soul, all right, until we're not, which is most of the time. And then things like what happened in Pittsburgh this past week happen. And they seem to be happening with greater frequency and becoming almost commonplace. We can't fix us because we are the problem. As Pogo once said, we have met the enemy, and the enemy is us. If we go back to our text, which I want us to do, the Apostle Paul said, if you look in the verses previous, he had a whole list of achievements and accomplishments. And he said all that stuff, all those achievements, all those accomplishments, all that he was, trying to make himself feel right, now he counted as rubbish, trash. Instead of seeking a righteousness of his own, he tells us in verse 9. He tells us that he has accepted the righteousness that comes from God and is by faith. What he's saying is simply this. I'm trusting in what Christ did to make me right with God, that's first and foremost, but then right within myself and right with others. He's trusting in the righteousness of God, and that is a choice that all of us will have to eventually make, and we'll make it either by design or by default. So what is the righteousness of God, by which and through which we are judged to be right? It is what God accomplished on the cross in His Son, Jesus Christ. And God takes sin seriously, even if we don't take it seriously, even if we don't recognize sin for what it is. God takes sin seriously. Now, there are two reasons God takes sin seriously. Listen. The first reason is because of what it does to us. Sin throws us out of whack, physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and obviously spiritually. But it is also the root of all out-of-whack relationships. It's what makes us feel not right for the part. But more importantly, the second reason, as the Bible tells us, is because the wages of sin is death. What that means first is that the reason all of us die biologically is because of sin. But if our sin problem is not dealt with effectively, then we also die spiritually. And here we talk about heaven and hell, whether we want to or not. And I know, we don't want to hear that. But nonetheless, it is literally the gospel truth. Sin is so serious that God cannot and will not look upon it. And sin is so serious that a price must be paid for our sinfulness. Because we are sinners ourselves, however, we are in no position to pay such a price. All human striving is at its root. So somehow we're trying to make up for our sinfulness ourselves, to justify ourselves, to find ourselves right ourselves. But we cannot. God is just, and His justice demands punishment for sin, a price for wrongdoing. Yet equally, God is a God of mercy and love. He desperately wants to forgive and to fill up His heaven with the creatures that He has made. He desperately wants to do that. So on the one hand, God's justice cries out for satisfaction that sin must be punished, that a price must be paid for our waywardness. But on the other hand, God's love desperately wants to gather all those who have been made in His image to Himself. How then can God's justice be satisfied and God's love and mercy be equally satisfied? And the answer is Jesus. P.T. Forsyth, the English writer back in the 1870s, wrote about a guerrilla band led by a man by the name of Schimmel. Schimmel was reacting against a brutal and cruel Russian regime. He brought together a small band of guerrillas. He brought them together as fighting men, but also in the process brought together their families as well. He thus created a society of people. And he sought to mold them in such a way that something could be accomplished, that they would be a moving force to gather others and move against the oppressive regime of the czars. Then one day, theft broke out in the camp. No society can be held together without laws. So Schimmel later said, for anyone caught stealing, there will be a penalty of 100 lashes. He sought to enforce this law. One day, they caught the thief. And the thief turned out to be his own mother. Schimmel was then caught in the dilemma. How could there be law and justice? And how could he express love toward even his own mother? He went to his tent and he spent 3 days trying to decide how he could respect both justice and love. When he came forth, he declared that the law must be obeyed. The penalty must be paid. He brought his mother out, and as the whip was already nearly laid upon her, Schimmel stepped forward, took off his coat and his shirt, and had the lashes laid on him. Both the law of justice was fulfilled and the principle of love equally fulfilled in the same way, but obviously in a much greater way and with much greater stakes, eternity itself. That is what God accomplished in Christ Jesus. Jesus did what we can and cannot do, could and cannot do. Pay the price for sin. He was and continues to be the perfect, unblemished sacrifice for sin. He who knew no sin became sin for us. That was His gift. That was the price He paid for our sinfulness. The greatest act of love ever known to the universe. On the cross, God's justice and God's mercy meet. Which leaves all of us with a choice. Either we accept God's solution for our sin problem, Jesus, His death on the cross, or we continue the long tradition of humanity and try to do it ourselves. One way is the will of God. The other is the way of failure of a humanity to save ourselves, to be made right, to get right, to somehow do it ourselves. One way is the righteousness of God. The other way, as Paul says, is a righteousness of my own. The will of God or our own will. It's not that hard choice to make. Which way, which will get us into heaven. And yet countless millions of people fail to make the right choice. Let us not be one of them. And if we've made the choice for the righteousness of God, it transforms us and we live it. And if we don't live it, then we have to examine ourselves and ask ourselves, what kind of righteousness do we really have? In a moment, we're going to take the Lord's Supper together.